Welcome back to the deep dive. And today we are not just looking at a law or a piece of history or a standard political maneuver. We are looking at what I think we can safely call the largest, most ambitious, and honestly, the most terrifying social experiment in the history of the human race.
Yeah, it really is a massive topic. And when you say experiment, I mean, that is not a metaphor. We are talking about a government policy that fundamentally altered the biology, the family structure, and the psychology of over 1 billion people.
We're talking, of course, about China's one-child policy. And I think for a lot of us, especially if you're listening in the West, we have this kind of headline understanding of it. You know, you can only have one kid, and if you have more, you pay a fine.
Right. The simple version.
Exactly. But when I started digging into the stack of sources we pulled for today, the internal memos, the demographic data, the sheer horror stories, it is so much more complex than that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not just a rule about babies. It's a story about science. It's about a very specific worldview, a mix of existential fear about starvation and a very specific type of, well, scientific arrogance, honestly, that reshaped a superpower.
Right.
So our mission today is to unpack how we got from a country that believed more people equals more power to a country that treated childbirth like a mathematical equation that just needed to be solved.
And what blew my mind right off the bat is the sheer contradiction of where we are today, because this policy, it was designed to save the economy by stopping population growth. That was the whole pitch.
That was the goal.
But now you look at the news today and the Chinese economy is facing a massive crisis, specifically because, well, because there aren't enough young people.
Yeah, that is the tragic irony at the heart of this deep dive. The solution to one problem became the exact cause of the next crisis. And what's fascinating is that the architects of this policy, the people who actually sat down and wrote the rules, they weren't sociologists. They weren't family therapists. They weren't even politicians, really. They were missile scientists.
Okay, hold on. I know we both read the source material, but we need to pause there for the listener. Missile scientists, like literal rocket science.
Literal rocket science,
Yeah.
aerospace engineers. And that is the aha moment we were going to get to in a bit. The one-child policy wasn't just political, it was mathematical. It was designed by engineers who looked at human society and saw a control system to be optimized, just like a guidance system on a missile.
That is just wild. I cannot wait to get into that because it explains so much about the rigidity of the whole thing. But before we get to the rocket science, we have to set the stage because China didn't always want fewer people, right?
No, quite the opposite, actually. If you go back to the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, the philosophy under Mao Zedong was very much strength in numbers.
Right. The logic being, if you want a powerful nation, especially a newly established communist nation that relies heavily on manual labor, you need bodies.
Exactly.
You need workers in the fields, you need soldiers in the army.
Mao famously believed that population growth directly empowered the country. He actually banned the import of contraceptives at one point because he wanted the population to grow so badly.
Oh.
Yeah. In 1949, the population was around 542 million. By 1969, so just 20 years later, it had exploded to 807 million.
That is a massive jump. That's like adding the entire population of the United States to the country in just 2 decades.
It is. And it wasn't just people having more babies. It was also that fewer people were dying. Infant mortality was dropping. Life expectancy was rising, going from about 35 years in 1948 up to 66 years by 1976. So naturally, the population just swelled.
But then something traumatic happens that completely changes the leadership's mind. And we have to talk about the famine here, because you don't just go from more is better to stop having kids immediately without a massive catalyst.
You don't. And the catalyst was the Great Chinese Famine. It lasted from the late 50s to the early 60s. And it is difficult to overstate the sheer trauma of this event. It resulted in the deaths of approximately 30 million people.
30 million people. That is a number that is just hard to even comprehend.
It was a staggering humanitarian catastrophe. And it deeply scarred the leadership. They looked at that rapid population growth we just talked about, and suddenly it didn't look like strength anymore. It looked like a very real threat. They were terrified of running out of food again.
They were basically terrified that the mouths to feed were multiplying faster than the rice they could grow.
Precisely. They feared a return to utter food insecurity. They saw all these new mouths and realized their resources, the land, the water, the grain, were finite. So the entire national mindset shifted from more is better to absolute crisis mode.
So before we even get to the strict one-child policy, they started trying to slow things down in the 70s. And this is something I didn't know before reading these sources. There was a soft approach before the hard approach.
Yes, there was. It was called the Wan Shishao campaign.
Wan Shishou,
That's
which translates to...
later, longer, fewer. The government started a massive public campaign in the early 1970s encouraging people to marry later in life, wait longer between pregnancies, and have fewer children overall.
And when you say campaign, this wasn't a strict law, right? It was more like aggressive encouragement.
Right. It was bureaucratic pressure, propaganda, and shifting social norms. Posters, slogans on walls, community meetings. But here is the key fact that often gets lost in the mainstream history, and it is crucial for you listening to understand. It worked.
Yeah, that blew me away.
It worked incredibly well.
How well are we talking, just to put numbers to it?
During the 1970s, under this later, longer, fewer policy, China's fertility rate plummeted from 5.9 births per woman down to 4.0, and eventually down to around 2.8 by 1979.
Wait, hold on. So the birth rate was already crashing. It was cut in half before the one-child policy even officially started.
Exactly. It was the fastest fertility decline in human history up to that point. The problem, as the government saw it, was already solving itself.
So if the problem is solving itself, right, if people were already having fewer kids voluntarily through social pressure, why on earth did they feel the need to implement the extreme one-child policy in 1980? That seems like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut that's already open.
That is the million-dollar quotient, and this is exactly where we loop back to your missile scientist. This is where the story shifts from sociology to engineering.
Okay, let's unpack this. Who is this guy?
His name is Song Jian. He was a control theorist and an aerospace engineer. He was actually protege of Qian Susan, who is known as the father of China's space program. These guys deal in ballistics, trajectories, absolute, unwavering precision.
Right. Their world is entirely binary. The rocket works or it explodes. There is no close enough in aerospace.
Exactly. And in 1980, Song Jian travels to Europe. He visits the University of Twente in the Netherlands, and he discovers cybernetics and control theory.
Okay, for the listener who isn't a mechanical engineer, what exactly is control theory?
The best way to think of it is like your thermostat at home. You set a target temperature, say 70 degrees. If the room drops to 60 degrees, the heat kicks on. If it hits 80 degrees, the AC kicks on. It's a self-correcting feedback loop. It measures the current output and adjusts the input to hit a very specific predetermined target.
Okay, that makes total sense for a thermostat. It makes sense for a guided missile adjusting its fins in midair to hit a target.
But Song Jian looks at the chaotic, messy, profoundly human population of China, 1 billion people with dreams and traditions and families, and he doesn't see people. He sees a system with a deviation. He sees a math problem.
He literally treats a grandmother wanting a grandson like a drag coefficient on a rocket.
That is literally how the math worked in his models. He teamed up with a group of mathematicians, and they ran these massive computer simulations, which, by the way, was incredibly cutting-edge technology for 1980s China. It looked like absolute magic to the Communist Party leadership. And from these models, they calculated an optimal population for China.
And what was the magic number the computer spit out?
700 million.
But wait, you said they were already at nearly 1 billion by the late 70s.
Exactly. They were at roughly 975 million. So Song Jian and his team presented these highly technical charts and graphs to the leadership. They argued that if the fertility rate remained constant at 3 births per woman, the population would hit 3 billion by 2060. It was a terrifying apocalyptic projection for a country that had just survived a famine.
So they basically walked in and said, we are an elite engineer team, we have done the math, and to get from 1 billion down to 700 million, we need to slam on the brakes right now.
Hard brakes. In control theory, if you are way off your target, you don't just gently tap the brakes. You apply maximum opposing force to correct the trajectory as fast as possible. They concluded that a universal, strict one-child limit for everyone was the absolute only way to meet that 700 billion target.
It really emphasizes how much they viewed the entire country as a machine. Input one child, output national prosperity.
That is exactly what it was. And because science and technology were held in such incredibly high regard, after the anti-intellectual chaos of the Cultural Revolution, the leadership bought it hook, line, and sinker. In September 1980, the policy was formally implemented. And interestingly, it was framed as a temporary measure, a one-generation policy to just get them over this demographic hump.
Wow. So let's get into the mechanics of this. How do you actually enforce something like this? Because passing a law telling people they can only have one kid is one thing. Actually making sure 1 billion people do it is a logistical nightmare.
It required a massive, unprecedented apparatus. They set up family planning commissions at every single level of government, from the top national tier all the way down to the local village level. And they used a very intense carrot and stick approach.
Let's start with the carrot. The sources detail this thing called the one-child honorary certificate.
Right. If a couple officially pledged to have only one child, they received this certificate. And it wasn't just a commemorative piece of paper. It came with real, tangible perks. Better housing allocation, healthcare subsidies, longer maternity leave, and maybe even a bit of extra money in their future pension fund.
Okay, so if you play by the rules, the state makes your life a little easier.
But if you broke the rules, that's where the stick comes in. And it was a very, very heavy stick.
The fines were astronomical, right? I was reading about this and I had to double check the numbers.
Yes, they were called the social maintenance fee. The bureaucratic idea was that if you have an extra child, you are burdening society's resources, so you have to pay society back for it. The fine could be anywhere from 3 to 6 times a family's annual income.
Hang on, let's pause on the math here for a second so this really sinks in. 3 to 6 times the annual household income.
Yes. So imagine you make $50,000 a year, and the government hands you a ticket for $300,000 simply because you had a second baby.
But that's not just a fine. That's an impossible sum. You can't get blood from a stone. If a poor farmer in rural Sichuan doesn't have the money, he doesn't have the money. So what actually happened? Did the government just shrug and say, pay us in installments when you can?
I really wish that were the case.
Mm-hmm.
This is where the enforcement system turns deeply predatory. Since normal people couldn't possibly pay, the local cadres, the officials responsible for enforcement, had to get creative. And by creative, I mean brutal. They would confiscate whatever held value. They would take livestock. They would take the family pig.
They took the pig.
They took the pig. They took the furniture, the television if they had one. And in some rural cases, they actually dismantled the roof of the house.
They took the roof off the house just to punish them.
It was a terror tactic. It was about making a very public example. The message was, if you violate the quota, we will dismantle your life piece by piece until you comply or pay. And you have to remember, these local officials had strict quotas to meet. If their village had too many babies, that official didn't get promoted. Their own livelihood was on the line.
Wow. So the system weaponized the career ambition of the local middle manager against his own neighbor.
Precisely. It pitted the community against itself. And this leads us to perhaps the most insidious, far-reaching part of the enforcement, the hukou system.
We keep seeing this word in the documents, hukou, H-U-K-O-U, and I feel like for someone listening in the US or Europe, it just translates to ID card, but it is so much more powerful than that, right? We need to explain why this specific tool was so devastating.
Oh, it is much, much more than an ID. Think of the hukou as a strict internal passport system. Imagine if you were born in Ohio and your passport permanently said Ohio. You are legally allowed to live, work, and get benefits in Ohio. But if you move to New York, you are effectively an illegal immigrant in your own country.
In your own country, just for crossing state lines.
Yes. You can't send your kids to a New York public school. You can't go to a New York hospital and get subsidized care. You can't legally buy an apartment. That is the hukou. It fundamentally ties your civil rights and access to social services to your exact birthplace.
Okay, so connect this back to the babies. If I have a second child, an unauthorized child, and I don't pay that massive $300,000 fine,
the government simply refuses to issue the passport. The hukou.
So the kid is essentially stateless.
They are a ghost. They exist physically. They are eating, breathing, and sleeping in your house.
Yeah.
But legally, the government computer says no. Which means when they turn 6 years old, they cannot walk into a classroom to learn to read. When they get a fever, they cannot walk into a legal clinic. They can't get a library card. They can't get a formal job later in life. They were known as Haihaisi, which translates to black children, meaning they were in the shadows.
That is just heartbreaking. You have millions of children growing up in the dark, unable to get an education or basic health care, simply because their parents couldn't afford a ruinous fine to legitimize their existence.
Correct. And that's just the bureaucratic paper violence. The source material also goes deeply into the physical enforcement. And we really have to be honest about this part of the history, even though it's tough to hear. It was incredibly brutal. In some periods and regions, enforcement involved mandatory IUDs, intrauterine devices, for women immediately after their first child.
And just to be clear, these weren't optional family planning suggestions.
No. By local law in many places, the IUD was forcibly inserted months after the first birth. You couldn't just go to a doctor and ask them to take it out.
Yeah.
There were regular mandatory inspections, actual X-ray checks to make sure the device was still in place.
And what if a woman did get pregnant with a second child?
Sterilization was often required. Tubal ligation for women, or sometimes vasectomies for men. But it went even further than that. If an unauthorized pregnancy was discovered, local officials, again under immense pressure to meet their quotas, would force women to terminate. This led to forced abortions, sometimes very, very late in the pregnancy.
The sources mention that specific case from 2012, Feng Jianmei.
Yes, the Feng Jianmei case. That was a pivotal moment that finally garnered massive international outrage. She was physically forced into an abortion 7 months into her pregnancy, simply because her family couldn't scrape together the money to pay the fine. Photos of her in the hospital bed circulated online. It was horrific, but it finally showed the whole world the extreme, visceral human cost of this policy.
It's terrifying to think about that level of state intrusion into literally the most private biological aspect of life. But, and here's where the history gets a little more complicated, the policy wasn't actually the same for everyone, was it?
That is a very important nuance. We call it the one-child policy. But by 2007, strictly speaking, only about 36% of the population was subject to a hard, no-exceptions one-child limit.
Wait, only 36%? That's barely a third of the country, so who are the others?
Well, there were exceptions woven in over time, largely because the grassroots resistance in rural areas was just too strong. In the cities where people lived in government-owned apartments and worked for state-owned enterprises, it was very easy to enforce. Your boss could literally check your records. But in the countryside, farmers desperately needed labor. They wanted sons to work the fields and carry on the family name. The central government eventually realized they couldn't enforce it 100% out there without causing a literal peasant revolution.
So the government had to bend to reality.
They did. They created what became known informally as the 1.5 child policy.
The 1.5 child policy. That sounds bizarre. How do you legally mandate half a kid?
It's a dark term of art. It meant that in many rural areas, if your first child was a boy, you stopped. That was it, one and done. But if your first child was a girl, you were legally allowed to have a second child to try for a son.
Wow. That just explicitly, legally codifies the idea that a girl isn't enough.
It absolutely does. It reinforces and legally validates the traditional son preference. It literally told the population, if you get a girl, try again. If you get a boy, you're done. And then beyond that, there were also exceptions for ethnic minorities. Groups like Tibetans or Uyghurs, at the time anyway, were often allowed 2, 3, or sometimes even 4 children, or had no strict limits in very remote areas.
Okay, so it was this massive, complicated patchwork system. But for the vast Han Chinese majority living in the cities, it was strictly one and done.
Exactly. And that high urban compliance is what created the Limbo Emperor generation, which is a whole other social phenomenon we will get to.
Right, so we have the mechanics laid out. We've got astronomical fines, hukou blackmail, horrific physical enforcement, and this weird 1.5 loophole in the country. Now we need to look at the fallout. Because, you can't interfere with human nature on this scale without massive society-altering side effects.
The side effects are profound. And the biggest, most immediately visible one is the massive gender imbalance.
We mentioned the son preference earlier. The phrase in the sources is Yanger Fang Lao, which translates to rear a son for your old age.
That is the deeply ingrained traditional belief. In a society that historically didn't have a robust state-sponsored pension system, your son is your retirement plan. Daughters marry out, they leave and join their husband's family to care for his parents. Sons stay, inherit the property, and take care of their own parents. So when the government suddenly steps in and says, you only get one shot at having a kid, everyone panicked. They felt they absolutely needed that one shot to be a boy.
And this is where modern technology meets ancient tradition in the absolute worst way possible.
Yes. Ultrasound technology became widely, cheaply available in clinics across China in the 1980s and 90s. Suddenly, parents could know the sex of the fetus months before birth. And even though the government made sex-selective abortion strictly illegal, it became rampant on the black market or through bribes. People would routinely abort female fetuses to save their one legal quota slot for a boy.
The numbers in the demographic data are just staggering because the natural biological baseline for humans everywhere in the world is about 105 boys born for every 100 girls.
Right. Nature favors boys slightly at birth. But in China, At the absolute height of the policy's enforcement, that ratio hit an incredible 117 boys to 100 girls. And in some specific rural provinces, it was even higher than that.
So what does that actually mean for society on the ground? You have millions of young men growing up who literally cannot find wives because those women do not exist.
Sociologists call them bear branches, or guangun in Chinese. Men who will not bear fruit, who will not carry on the family tree. Estimates vary, but we are talking about 30 million or more missing women. Women who statistically should have been born, but weren't, or who died in infancy due to deliberate neglect.
30 million. I mean, if you think about that, that's the entire population of a medium-sized country, just missing from the census.
And for the men left behind, it creates a massive social crisis. In rural areas, you have entire villages made up almost entirely of bachelors. It drastically drives up bride prices. It leads directly to the human trafficking of women from neighboring poorer countries like Vietnam or Cambodia, and it creates a constant low-level fear for the government about social instability. A huge concentrated population of unattached, economically frustrated young men is historically a recipe for political trouble.
Right. The government is terrified of Bear Branches organizing. Then there is the other side of the demographic coin, the children who actually were born under the rules, the so-called little emperors.
The 4-2-1 family structure, this is crucial. 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child.
That one child is basically the center of the universe.
Exactly. All the financial resources, all the daily attention, all the intense hopes and dreams of 6 adults are completely focused on one single kid.
I have heard so many anecdotes about this. The kid gets the absolute best food at the table, the most expensive private tutors, the newest imported toys. But the psychological pressure?
The pressure is crushing. Imagine being a 10-year-old and being the sole focus of 6 adults' financial anxieties and unfulfilled dreams. There are a lot of conflicting psychological studies on this generation. Some researchers say these kids grew up to be more narcissistic, less cooperative, playing into that spoiled brat stereotype. But other studies show they actually have higher IQs and much higher academic achievement simply because of that massive, concentrated investment of time and money.
But it's a very lonely kind of pressure, right? If you fail the college entrance exam, the entire family fails. There is no brother or sister to share the burden or succeed where you didn't.
And that burden becomes very, very literal when those 6 adults get old. This is the 4-2-1 problem in reverse. Imagine being 35 years old. You and your spouse, who is also an only child, now have to financially and physically support 4 aging parents and potentially up to 8 aging grandparents, all on just 2 incomes.
That's the economic nightmare we teased in the intro. The state pension system couldn't handle the load because historically the family was the pension system, but the state's own policy systematically dismantled the family.
Precisely. You have a rapidly aging population, people living longer, and a dramatically shrinking young workforce to actually pay the taxes and provide the care for them. It's an inverted demographic pyramid, and that is exactly why the government finally started to panic.
Right. So let's move to the last phase here, part 4, the reversal. The government looks at the math again and realizes, uh-oh, we severely overcorrected.
They realize the demographic dividend, that temporary, massive boost to the economy you get from having very few dependent kids, and a huge bulge of working-age adults, that dividend was ending. They were suddenly staring down the barrel of a severe labor shortage and an unprecedented elder care crisis.
So talk me through the timeline of the retreat. How did they walk this back?
It started very slowly, very cautiously. In 2013, they relaxed the rules just a bit. They said if one parent in a couple was an only child, they were legally allowed to have 2 kids.
And did that work? Did people jump at the chance?
Not really.
Yeah.
The uptake was significantly lower than the government expected.
Yeah.
So sensing the urgency, in 2016 they went for the big policy shift, the universal 2-child policy. Everyone, regardless of background, can now have 2 kids.
I remember reading the headlines back then. Everyone in the global financial press thought, here comes the massive Chinese baby boom.
But the boom never came. There was a tiny, brief blip in the data for about a year, and then the steady decline just continued.
So they panicked again.
Yes. In 2021, they abruptly announced the 3-child policy. And then shortly after, in July 2021, they basically removed all limits entirely and actually started introducing incentives, cash handouts, cheaper state-run childcare, tax breaks, all to desperately try to get people to have more babies.
And what happened?
And silence. The birth rate just kept dropping. In 2022 and 2023, China saw record low births, hovering right around 9 million a year. To put that in perspective, that is roughly half of what it was just a few years prior.
This is the part I really struggle to wrap my head around. The Communist Party of China is arguably one of the most powerful, capable organizations on Earth. They built a massive high-speed rail network across an entire continent in a decade. They built entire megacities from scratch.
If they tell people, have babies, why aren't people listening?
Because they broke the narrative. They succeeded too well. For 40 solid years, the state propaganda machine didn't just say, one child is a strict law. It said, one child is better. Posters everywhere showed happy, modern, wealthy couples with one beautiful daughter wearing nice clothes holding a university diploma. Right, they deliberately equated small families with being modern and civilized, and they painted large families as backward, rural, and poor.
Exactly. And over 4 decades, that propaganda seeped deeply into the very bones of the society. You have an entire generation of young women now who look at the lives of their grandmothers, women who had 5 kids, ruined their bodies with labor, and had absolutely no life outside the domestic sphere, and these modern women say, no thank you, I want a career.
So it's not just about the money, because I know raising kids there is notoriously expensive.
It is incredibly expensive, yes. The cost of living in Chinese Tier 1 cities is astronomically high. The education competition, driven by that little emperor need to provide the absolute best tutors and schools, makes raising even one child a massive financial burden. But no, it's not just money. Women have fundamentally changed. They are highly educated. They have their own incomes. They have autonomy. They have zero desire to return to being viewed as baby-making machines for the state.
So the fundamental mindset of what a good life is has completely shifted. You can't just flip a policy switch and say, okay, everyone, go back to the 1950s agrarian mindset.
Exactly. People got very used to the dual-income, one-kid lifestyle. It affords a level of freedom and disposable income that is incredibly hard to willingly give up. You cannot spend 40 years drilling a hole in the bottom of a boat and then just hand someone a bucket and say, hey, fix it. The very concept of what a family is has been completely re-engineered. And this brings us right back to our missile scientists from the beginning.
How so? The control theory idea.
Yes. They thought of human beings as simple variables in an equation. If the population number is too high, turn the policy dial down. If the number is too low, just turn the dial back up. But humans aren't variables. We have memories, we have deep generational trauma, and we have cultural inertia. You simply cannot just turn a dial on a living culture and expect it to immediately obey.
I want to briefly touch on one other legacy before we start to wrap this up, because it's very relevant to our Western listeners. International adoption. Because for a long time, particularly in the U.S., when people thought of international adoption, they almost immediately thought of Chinese baby girls.
Yes, that was direct, tragic byproduct of the policy combining with that rural son preference. Families who felt forced to abandon their newborn daughters in hopes of trying again for a son often left them in public places to be found by orphanages. Tens of thousands of these girls were subsequently adopted internationally, building huge diaspora communities.
But that era has officially ended too, hasn't it?
It has. As the domestic supply of children has drastically shrunk due to the falling birth rates, and as national pride has risen on the global stage, the government has steadily tightened the rules. In 2024, they effectively ended the international adoption program for non-relatives entirely. It marks the definitive end of a very specific, painful chapter of this demographic history.
So, looking at the big picture, let's try to sum this all up. The Chinese government still officially claims the policy was a triumph. They say it averted 400 million births.
That is the official party line. They say, look, we saved the planet from 400 million extra people consuming resources, we helped the global climate, we stabilized our food supply, and we created the conditions for our economic miracle.
But the demographic scholars we read, they push back hard on that narrative, don't they?
They absolutely do. Demographers point to neighboring countries like Thailand or South Korea, which also saw massive, rapid drops in their fertility rates during the exact same period. And they did it without draconian laws or forced abortions, just simply through rapid economic development, urbanization, and educating women. The scholars argue that much of China's birth rate drop would have happened naturally anyway as the country got richer. The policy just artificially accelerated it with an immense amount of unnecessary human pain.
So ultimately, they traded a short-term economic boom, the demographic dividend, for a long-term demographic nightmare.
That is probably the most accurate way to describe it. They bought themselves 30 years of blisteringly fast economic growth, but the bill for that growth is finally coming due right now.
It really leaves you with a heavy question to ponder. We talked about control theory, about treating millions of human lives like variables on a spreadsheet.
And that is exactly the final provocation I'd leave the listener with today. We've seen that governments have proven, definitively, that they can turn the population tap off through brute force, strict law, and fear. But we are seeing right now, not just in China, but in Japan, in South Korea, in parts of Europe, can any government actually force the tap back on once the culture itself has changed?
That is a chilling thought. You can use the law to stop life, but can you use the law to compel it?
All the demographic evidence so far suggests the answer is a resounding no.
Well, on that heavy note, we are going to wrap up this deep dive. It's a dense, often dark topic, but it's such an important one to truly understand the geopolitical world we live in today.
Absolutely. It shapes everything from global supply chains to international relations.
So, if you're listening, we'd love to have you think about this. How does state policy shape your own family history? Have a think about it. Thanks for taking this journey with us, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.
Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Welcome to another deep dive. We are really thrilled you could join us today. If you're the kind of learner who constantly dissects the intricate, often hidden machinery driving our global society, well, you are definitely in the right place.
Absolutely. It's a complex topic today.
It really is. Today, we're undertaking a comprehensive analysis of an entity you already know by name, but likely haven't conceptualized in its current highly complex form. We're talking about the World Food Program, or the WFP.
Right, and it's a completely different organization than most people picture.
Exactly. Because given your understanding of global affairs, you already know that modern humanitarian aid is a far cry from the mid-century footage of cargo planes just dropping pallets of grain onto open fields. The realities of frontline operations have evolved drastically.
We had to. The scale of the crises demands it.
Yeah. But what might surprise you is the sheer technological and geopolitical density of fighting global hunger today. I mean, we are looking at a landscape dominated by artificial intelligence, decentralized blockchain ledgers, biometric identity verification in some of the most remote deserts on Earth.
Not to mention a supply chain apparatus that navigates the most volatile, politically fraught environments imaginable.
Right. And that brings us to our mission for this deep dive. We are drawing from a really comprehensive Wikipedia overview of the World Food Program. This source material maps out the organization's entire trajectory.
From its post-World War II inception straight through to the granular details of its current global footprint.
Yeah, and it heavily details the digital innovations currently deployed on the front lines. But it also, and I think this is crucial, it does not shy away from the severe existential vulnerabilities the WFP is facing right now in the mid-2020s.
Right, we have hard data on immediate funding cliffs, the geopolitical leverage applied to aid, and even deep-seated institutional critiques regarding efficiency.
Exactly. We are going to synthesize all of this, the operational, the technological, and the institutional data, to give you a clear picture of how this massive apparatus actually functions under stress. So what does this all mean?
Well, it means we need to establish the baseline parameters of their mandate first, and their historical footprint, because the current institutional challenges they're directly tied to how and why the WFP was built in the first place.
Which was back in 1961, right?
Yes, formally established in 1961, emerging directly from a 1960 Food and Agriculture Organization conference. And the genesis of this is quite telling. The original proposal was driven by George McGovern, who was serving as the director of the United States Food for Peace programs.
Oh, okay. I'm going to pause on that for a second because the context is vital here. You have the director of a major U.S. domestic and foreign policy tool food for peace pushing for a UN-managed program.
It wasn't just pure altruism.
No, not at all. This was the height of the Cold War. The U.S. had massive agricultural surpluses, and channeling food aid through a multilateral body like the UN was a highly strategic way to stabilize volatile regions without it looking entirely like unilateral American foreign policy.
Right, it provided a layer of international legitimacy, but it wasn't an overnight global rollout. The documentation notes that the WFP began with a very specific localized test case.
In 1963.
Exactly. The initial deployment was approved strictly on a 3-year experimental basis. The target was the Nubian population at Wadi Halfa in Sudan. And again, understanding the mechanics of this is important.
Because it wasn't a natural disaster.
Right, this wasn't just a random response to a drought. The Nubian population was facing massive displacement due to the construction of the Aswan High Dam. So right from its inception, the WFP was testing its ability to manage the logistical fallout of major infrastructure and geopolitical displacement.
Not just natural famine. And the experiment was deemed highly effective, obviously, because by 1965, the program was institutionalized on a permanent, continuing basis.
And the scaling from that 1963 experiment in Sudan to its current footprint is almost difficult to wrap your head around.
It really is. Let's look at the modern operational metrics for a second. Headquartered in Rome, Italy, the WFP is now the largest humanitarian organization on the planet. They maintain operational offices in 87 countries.
And they have an active footprint in over 120 countries and territories.
Yeah. And in terms of human capital, as of 2023, the organization was running on a workforce of over 22,300 staff members.
And that massive workforce is managing a truly staggering volume of aid. The data for 2023 shows the WFP supported over 152 million people.
152 million.
Yeah. When you conceptualize the logistics required to procure, secure, transport, and distribute life-saving resources to that many distinct individuals across, it says, essentially every active conflict zone and disaster area globally, you begin to understand why the WFP functions less like a traditional charity and more like a massive, quasi-state logistical military operation.
That's a great way to put it. And to structure that operation, the WFP operates as an executive member of the United Nations Sustainable Development Group. Their primary defining mandate is SDG 2, which is zero hunger by the year 2030. But hitting that goal requires a methodology that goes way beyond emergency triage.
What's fascinating here is the deliberate strategic pivot the organization has made over the last decade regarding that methodology. There's been a harsh realization within the broader humanitarian sector that perpetual emergency food aid, simply handing out calories year after year, can severely distort local agricultural markets.
Right. It inadvertently engineers long-term dependency. If you flood a market with free food, local farmers can't sell their crops.
Exactly. So the WFP has heavily shifted its focus toward fostering localized, long-term economic development and infrastructural resilience.
The documentation provides a very clear look at the mechanics of this shift through a program called Food Assistance for Assets, or the FFA. Now, conditional aid isn't entirely new. For decades, organizations relied on cash for work or food for work models.
But historically, the objective of those programs was just to create a justification for the distribution.
Yeah, the labor itself was basically busy work, digging ditches and filling them back in. But the FFA completely inverts that model. The focus is entirely on the macroeconomic value of the asset being created by the community.
Precisely. Under the FFA framework, the WFP utilizes cash or direct food transfers to stabilize a community's immediate nutritional crisis. But the conditionality is tied to hard infrastructure development, projects that address the root cause of their vulnerability.
So we're talking about real engineering projects, the excavation and repair of complex irrigation networks, the systemic restoration of degraded land, implementing watershed management systems, or even building physical bridges and access roads to connect isolated villages to regional markets.
It's the old adage of teaching a man to fish, but scaled up to a macroeconomic level.
Right. It's like upgrading it to paying a community to build their own sustainable fishery. It's a highly sophisticated evolution in aid mechanics. They are effectively acting as an infrastructure investment bank. They capitalize a community to build its own agricultural foundation while using their aid to underwrite the immediate caloric needs of the workforce.
It treats the systemic deficit, the lack of infrastructure and market access, rather than just applying a temporary bandage to the symptom of hunger.
And we see that same macroeconomic strategy applied directly to agricultural markets through their involvement in the Farm to Market Alliance. They connect smallholder farmers directly to commercial supply chains. A prime case study detailed in the sources is the Purchase for Progress, or P4P pilot.
That launched back in 2008.
Yes, and this wasn't just a small localized test. It ran for 5 years across 20 countries spanning Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The WFP didn't just use its capital to buy crops, it fundamentally restructured the local agricultural economies. They provided rigorous training to 800,000 smallholder farmers.
And the training covered advanced agricultural production methodologies, critical post-harvest handling to mitigate crop spoilage, and rigorous quality assurance standards required by international markets.
which is huge for getting fair prices. They also taught agricultural finance structures and group marketing strategies to give these farmers real leverage against predatory middlemen. The output of that pilot was immense. 366,000 metric tons of food produced, generating over $148 million in direct income for those smallholder farmers.
It's an incredibly efficient dual-purpose utilization of their own supply chain. By elevating the quality and yield of local farmers, the WFP can pivot its procurement strategy to source food locally.
Which drastically slashes their massive international shipping and cold chain logistics costs.
Exactly. It significantly reduces the lead time to get food to vulnerable populations and simultaneously injects institutional capital into the local economy, theoretically removing those farmers from the vulnerability matrix altogether.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We've been discussing infrastructure and agricultural training, which, while highly effective, are still grounded in traditional developmental economics. But the WFP has aggressively integrated advanced digital architectures to bypass physical limitations entirely.
This is driven largely by the WFP Innovation Accelerator.
Right, which has sourced and scaled over 60 high-tech projects across 45 countries.
The juxtaposition of the environments they operate in against the technologies they are deploying is pretty stark. The most prominent example is the Building Blocks program, which initiated in 2017.
The operational challenge there was severe. The WFP needed a secure, fraud-resistant mechanism to distribute cash-equivalent assistance to Syrian refugees residing in massive, highly dense camps in Jordan, like the Azraq and Zaatari camps.
Traditional financial distribution in a stateless, transient environment is a logistical nightmare. Distributing physical currency invites immediate security risks, extortion, and theft.
And paper vouchers are easily lost, counterfeited, or sold on secondary black markets. Plus, traditional banking infrastructure either doesn't exist in a refugee camp or charges exorbitant transaction fees that just eat right into the aid budget.
So the WFP bypassed the traditional financial system entirely by deploying a private blockchain.
A lot of people still conflate blockchain purely with cryptocurrency speculation.
Yes, but at its core, it is simply an immutable, decentralized ledger. In the context of Building Blocks, the WFP utilized this ledger to establish secure, digitized identities for the Syrian refugees. The operational mechanics are brilliant in their efficiency.
So when a refugee goes to a designated grocery facility within the camp, there is no exchange of cash, no physical vouchers, not even a magnetic stripe card.
They use biometric verification. The individual simply looks into an iris scanner at the checkout. The cryptographic hash of their biometric data is instantly authenticated against their secure digital identity on the blockchain.
And the exact cost of their provisions is automatically reconciled and deducted from their WFP entitlement account.
The systemic benefits are massive. It entirely eliminates the reliance on local financial service providers, which reportedly saved the WFP millions of dollars in banking fees, capital that was immediately redirected into actual food procurement.
It also drastically reduces the surface area for systemic fraud. But perhaps most importantly for you listening, think about what it means to provide a highly secure, immutable digital identity to a stateless population. When individuals flee a conflict zone, they frequently lose passports, civil registries, banking histories.
Right, their entire documented existence is gone. The blockchain provides a durable verification of their identity and transactions that cannot be erased by a collapsing state apparatus.
It's a remarkable application of cryptography for humanitarian stability. And the digital integration extends into other highly complex operational areas, like the SMP PLUS system. Now, the WFP is the largest provider of school meals globally. This serves a dual purpose, providing essential childhood nutrition and creating a massive economic incentive for impoverished families to keep their children in the educational system rather than pulling them out for manual labor.
But formulating those global meal programs is a logistical labyrinth. It is a massive multivariate optimization problem.
You have to design menus that meet stringent nutritional macros, conform to highly specific local cultural and religious dietary restrictions, stay within incredibly tight budgetary constraints, and adapt to the fluctuating availability of local agricultural yields.
SMP PLUS approaches this by utilizing artificial intelligence algorithms to dynamically generate and optimize these global menu plans.
The AI is essentially cross-referencing global nutritional targets against the real-time, hyperlocal agricultural supply chain data we talked about earlier. So if there's a sudden local surplus of a specific nutrient-dense crop, the AI can instantly recalibrate the regional school menus to absorb that surplus.
It feeds the children while injecting cash straight into the local farming community.
Exactly. And we also see a push toward agricultural autonomy in environments where traditional farming is geologically impossible. The operational data details the deployment of hydroponic initiatives right in the middle of the Sahara Desert.
These are specialized, low-tech hydroponic units provided to refugee populations, designed to cultivate barley specifically for livestock feed.
That requires a moment of real consideration. They are engineering agricultural yields in one of the most hostile, arid, and soil-depleted environments on the planet. By utilizing enclosed water recycling hydroponic systems, they're enabling refugees to sustain their livestock, which in many pastoral cultures is their sole form of wealth and economic stability.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, all of these seemingly disparate innovations, the biometric blockchain ledgers in Jordan, the AI-driven menu algorithms, the Saharan hydroponics, they are all unified by a single strategic imperative.
Maximizing the velocity and efficiency of resource distribution.
Exactly. And the ultimate expression of that efficiency is the organization's massive pivot toward direct cash assistance. Historically, food aid was strictly in-kind shipping physical commodities.
Sacks of grain on boats.
Right. But the data shows a radical transformation. In just the first half of 2022, the WFP dispersed an astonishing $1.6 billion in cash transfers directly to 37 million individuals across 70 different nations.
They utilize whatever mechanism fits the local infrastructure: physical banknotes, secure debit cards, or mobile money transfers.
The economic rationale for cash over physical food is robust, provided local markets are actually functioning. When you distribute cash, you afford the recipient the dignity of choice. They can procure the specific dietary necessities of their household.
But on a macroeconomic level, you are instantly injecting massive liquidity directly into the localized supply chain. The recipients spend that money at local markets, which supports local merchants, who in turn purchase from local farmers. It creates a powerful economic multiplier effect.
Then we have empirical validation of this approach. The documentation cites a rigorous 2022 study conducted by the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. They analyzed an emergency social safety net program in Turkey that utilized this cash transfer model.
And their findings definitively concluded that these direct cash injections significantly reduce the incidence and intensity of multidimensional poverty among the target demographic. It wasn't merely a caloric intervention, it fundamentally stabilized their broader economic reality.
However, we have to ground this technological and economic optimism in the brutal reality of their primary operational theater. While AI and blockchain are highly effective in stable or semi-stable environments, the vast majority of the WFP's resources are consumed by chaotic, kinetic environments.
Active war zones.
Yes. The data indicates that approximately 2/3 of the WFP's life-saving food assistance is deployed to populations whose severe food insecurity is driven directly by armed conflict and systemic violence.
It's a statistical certainty. Over 60% of the global population currently facing acute hunger resides in zones actively experiencing armed violence. The intersection of conflict and famine is absolute. Combat operations actively destroy agricultural infrastructure, deliberate blockades sever commercial supply chains, and millions of agrarian civilians are displaced from their land, entirely collapsing local food production.
This intrinsic link between geopolitical violence and mass starvation is precisely why the World Food Program was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2020.
The Nobel Committee explicitly recognized the organization not just for its logistical capacity to deliver calories, but for its role in mitigating the conditions that fuel conflict.
And crucially, for operating as a bulwark against the weaponization of food by state and non-state actors.
The weaponization of food is a stark reality. When the executive director at the time, David Beasley, accepted that Nobel Prize, he bypassed the standard diplomatic platitudes. He utilized the global broadcast to issue a severe warning, directly demanding that the ultra-wealthy step in to bridge a critical $5 billion funding deficit required immediately to prevent 30 million people from slipping into famine.
And unfortunately, the trajectory has not improved since then. The documentation references the joint WFP and FAO Hunger Hotspots Outlook covering June to October 2024.
That report maps out a deteriorating security environment, projecting severe worsening of acute food insecurity across 18 separate geopolitical hotspots.
More concerningly, It isolates 5 specific regions where the populations are actively facing or are at critical risk of IPC Phase 5 conditions.
For you listening, it's really important to understand what IPC Phase 5 actually means. The Integrated Food Security Phase classification is the standardized global scale used to measure food crises. Phase 5 is the absolute terminal end of that scale. It is the classification for catastrophe or outright famine.
It signifies an environment where, despite any available coping strategies, households are experiencing an absolute lack of food, leading directly to mass starvation, death, and destitution.
And the 5 regions identified at this critical threshold in the 2024 report were Haiti, Mali, Palestine, South Sudan, and Sudan.
Executing logistics in an IPC Phase 5 environment, which is almost invariably an active war zone, requires infrastructural capabilities that rival the logistics commands of top-tier militaries. Commercial freight and civilian airlines simply cannot and will not secure insurance or airspace clearance to operate in these sectors.
Therefore, the WFP has had to build its own parallel global infrastructure. The primary component of this is UNHAS, the United Nations Humanitarian Air Service. It is entirely managed by the WFP. They are effectively operating a massive private global airline dedicated exclusively to humanitarian access.
They manage a complex fleet of rotary and fixed-wing aircraft, servicing over 300 highly volatile destinations worldwide.
This is the mechanism that bypasses destroyed roads and blockaded ports to insert emergency technical personnel, medical teams, and critical supplies directly into the epicenter of a crisis. And that aviation network is supplied by the UNHRD, the United Nations Humanitarian Response Depot. This is a strategically positioned global network of high-capacity logistics hubs.
What's crucial to understand is that the WFP doesn't just manage this for its own operations. Within the UN system, the WFP is the designated lead agency for the Interagency Standing Committee's logistics cluster.
Let's unpack that term because it defines their true role in the humanitarian world. The logistics cluster means that when a massive crisis hits, say a catastrophic earthquake, the World Health Organization might procure the trauma kits, and the UN Refugee Agency might procure the emergency shelters, but it is the WFP that is responsible for actually moving all of it.
They provide the centralized cold chain storage, the heavy lift transport, and the supply chain architecture for the entire global humanitarian community. They are literally the circulatory system for global emergency response.
This raises an important question, though. With the operational tempo accelerating due to the compounding effects of climate change and geopolitical instability, can a system built purely on reactive logistics continue to function?
The data suggests that a purely reactionary posture is becoming financially and operationally untenable. Consequently, the WFP is heavily prioritizing preemptive, forecast-based financing to mitigate the impact of environmental shocks before they materialize.
The operational documentation highlights a fascinating execution of this strategy in Bangladesh. It's a total paradigm shift in disaster management. Rather than waiting for the seasonal monsoons to trigger catastrophic flooding, displacing the population, and then attempting to fly in emergency rations, the WFP integrated deeply with advanced meteorological forecasting systems.
They established specific meteorological thresholds. When the data definitively projected an incoming flood event that would exceed local resilience capacities, the WFP immediately executed mobile cash transfers directly to highly vulnerable agrarian households.
Crucially, this capital was injected before the torrential rains commenced.
The economic efficiency of this is profound. By providing that liquidity days in advance, those farmers had the capital to purchase materials to fortify their structures, procure and stockpile essential food and medical reserves, and secure transportation to move their livestock and assets to higher elevations.
It is exponentially more cost-effective and vastly more humane to finance a population's disaster preparedness than to attempt the monumental logistical task of saving them after their entire regional infrastructure has been annihilated. We observed a similar preemptive deployment methodology in the Caribbean surrounding Hurricane Dorian in September 2019.
The WFP had already established a regional command center in Barbados the previous year specifically to shorten response times. As meteorological models tracked Dorian toward the Bahamas, the WFP didn't wait for landfall.
They pre-deployed specialized technical teams encompassing food security, heavy logistics, and emergency telecommunications. They executed an initial aerial reconnaissance sweep almost immediately after the eye passed, enabling them to sequence and insert ground teams the absolute second the airspace was viable.
We also see this proactive stance in the Sahel region of Africa, where they are actively financing community projects to construct water harvesting infrastructure and restore degraded land to create a physical and economic buffer against the dual threats of aggressive desertification and encroaching armed militancy.
It is a highly sophisticated, constantly adapting machine. Okay, let's unpack this. Because despite the AI algorithms, the biometric blockchains, and the incredibly advanced predictive logistics, the entire apparatus is built on a structural foundation that is inherently fragile.
Extremely fragile.
The absolute Achilles heel of the World Food Program is its economic model. The WFP relies entirely 100% on voluntary donations.
This is a critical distinction. Unlike core UN functions such as peacekeeping operations or the Central Secretariat, which are funded by assessed, mandatory contributions from member states, the WFP operates essentially hand-to-mouth.
They must perpetually solicit funding from donor governments, corporate entities, and private individuals. This voluntary architecture introduces extreme, unpredictable volatility into their long-term operational planning. And the data from the last few years illustrates exactly how terrifying that volatility can be.
In 2022, responding to a massive surge in overlapping global crises, donor funding for the WFP spiked to an unprecedented record of $14.1 billion. That represented a nearly 50% increase from 2021.
The United States was the dominant contributor to that surge. However, it is vital to note that even at a record-breaking $14.1 billion, they were still massively underfunded against an internally projected operational requirement of $21.4 billion.
But the true shock to the system arrived the following year. In 2023, funding violently contracted, plummeting to just $8.3 billion.
This marked the first year-over-year decrease in funding since 2010. That collapse from $14.1 billion to $8.3 billion generated a catastrophic 64% operational funding gap. I want you to conceptualize the administrative reality of that. You are tasked with maintaining a logistical lifeline for 152 million people, many in active war zones, and your operational budget is suddenly slashed by nearly half.
The immediate, unavoidable result on the ground is the reduction of daily caloric rations to populations that are already severely malnourished, simply to stretch the remaining capital. This extreme structural vulnerability is brought into stark focus by recent developments detailed in our operational sources. And before we proceed, it is imperative that we outline the parameters of this next segment.
Yes, absolutely. For you listening, we want to be exceptionally clear regarding our methodology here. The data we are about to discuss involves recent U.S. funding directives from early 2025 and highly charged geopolitical policy shifts. We, as your hosts, are not adopting any political stance, nor are we evaluating the morality or political efficacy of these policies.
Our objective is strictly and impartially to report the factual sequence of events detailed in the source material, solely to demonstrate the mechanical vulnerabilities of a massive humanitarian organization that is entirely reliant on voluntary, single-state funding.
With that framework established, the operational documentation notes that in February 2025, the WFP was subjected to directives from the United States government halting operations across numerous U.S.-funded grants.
The documentation specifically highlights that this suspension was enacted despite an emergency waiver issued by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a waiver that was explicitly intended to authorize the continuation of essential food assistance.
The sources indicate that these suspended operations involve grants managed primarily by the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. The financial magnitude is significant, involving tens of millions of dollars in frozen operational capital.
The geographic impact of this suspension hits the absolute core of the WFP's most critical missions, directly impacting operations in Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, Haiti, and Mali.
Furthermore, the documentation details that this suspension deeply affects operations under the Food for Peace Title II program. To understand the operational impact, we must look at the mechanics of Title II. This is not simply a cash transfer.
Title II historically allocates approximately $2 billion annually for the procurement and international donation of physical U.S. agricultural commodities. It is a massive component of the global food supply chain, jointly administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and USAID.
Again, analyzing this purely from a logistical and structural standpoint, the suspension demonstrates a profound systemic fragility. When the world's largest humanitarian logistics network is tied directly to the discretionary, voluntary funding of individual nation-states, Complex domestic policy shifts or geopolitical realignments within a primary donor state can instantly freeze billions of dollars in active frontline operations.
It fundamentally compromises the WFP's capacity to execute long-term, multi-year developmental strategies or maintain continuous supply lines into volatile regions.
And this structural financial vulnerability is compounded by intense scrutiny regarding the organization's internal efficiency and bureaucratic efficacy. Managing a global workforce of over 22,000 personnel across 87 nations inevitably creates massive bureaucratic overhead and friction.
The documentation cites a highly critical study published in 2018 by the Center for Global Development. This study evaluated 40 distinct international aid programs.
The methodology of that study focused on 4 primary criteria: maximizing operational efficiency, fostering local institutions, reducing administrative burdens, and maintaining transparency and learning. Out of the 40 programs evaluated against those metrics, the WFP was ranked absolute last.
A ranking of that nature forces a critical examination of the organization's operational architecture. Much of that inefficiency stems from the inherent friction of operating heavily in active conflict zones, where the cost of security, logistics, and supply chain losses are astronomical compared to standard development projects.
However, it also feeds directly into a much deeper, highly contested debate within the macroeconomic and humanitarian sectors regarding the ultimate net effectiveness of large-scale aid. There is a robust analytical argument that massive, continuous injections of external food aid, if not managed with absolute precision, can generate severe unintended consequences.
In complex geopolitical conflicts, large-scale aid operations can inadvertently extend the duration of a war. Warlords and militant factions frequently attempt to impose taxes on aid convoys, intercept shipments, or control distribution access to consolidate their own power and fund their militant operations.
The WFP operates acutely aware of this dynamic, and it routinely forces the leadership into executing brutal operational calculus. The documentation provides a stark example from 2020, noting that the WFP was forced to have its aid distribution in the Houthi-controlled territories of Yemen.
The reality of that decision is incredibly dark.
Yeah.
The WFP is forced to weigh the immediate starvation of a civilian population against the systemic risk that their massive supply chain is being diverted to actively sustain the very militant structures driving the conflict. It is an operational tightrope with catastrophic human consequences on either side.
Compounding these external geopolitical pressures are significant internal institutional challenges. The documentation candidly references internal surveys conducted across 2018 and 2019 that expose deep-seated cultural and structural issues within the WFP's workforce, prominently including allegations of sexual harassment and an abusive workplace culture.
This presents a holistic, unvarnished view of the organization. The World Food Program is not an idealized, frictionless monolith of pure altruism. It is a highly stressed, massive human bureaucracy operating at the absolute extremes of global volatility, wrestling with internal cultural decay, immense logistical constraints, and the constant threat of operational defunding.
It is worth noting regarding their institutional development that the organization has initiated structural reforms to address transparency. The documentation indicates the WFP joined the International Aid Transparency Initiative in 2013, attempting to open their massive financial ledgers to external auditing.
And in the 2024 Aid Transparency Index, conducted by the organization Publish What You Fund, the WFP achieved a score of 84.5, which classifies as a very good metric for financial visibility. So there's a systemic effort to enforce accountability over the billions of dollars flowing through their architecture.
We have analyzed an immense spectrum of data today. We've traced the WFP's evolutionary arc from a localized experimental deployment responding to the Aswan Dam displacement in 1963 to a colossal logistical apparatus supporting 152 million human beings annually. We've examined the macroeconomic shift away from perpetual in-kind food distribution, dissecting how the Food Assistance for Assets program attempts to engineer long-term infrastructural resilience.
We've detailed the incredible integration of digital architectures, deploying private blockchains to secure identities and bypass banking friction in Jordan, utilizing AI algorithms to optimize global agricultural supply chains for school meals, and implementing forecast-based financing to beat the meteorological curve in Bangladesh.
And we have critically evaluated the immense vulnerabilities threatening the entire structure, from the geopolitical weaponization of food to the 64% operational funding gap and the sudden, devastating freeze of U.S. international grants in early 2025. For you, the listener, whether your primary analytical focus is the optimization of ultra-complex global supply chains, the real-world deployment of decentralized cryptographic ledgers in stateless environments, or the fragile macroeconomic architecture that prevents geopolitical collapse, the WFP sits squarely at the intersection of all these disciplines.
It serves as the ultimate real-time stress test for whether the international community's safety nets possess the structural integrity to withstand an era defined by compounding concurrent global crises. It is the definitive test case of our era. And as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you with an analytical projection to consider, building upon the vulnerabilities we've mapped out.
Let's hear it.
If the frequency and intensity of climate anomalies continue to accelerate, locking in tandem with expanding multi-theater armed conflicts, and if the primary geopolitical powers financing this system can instantaneously freeze billions of dollars in critical operational capital due to internal domestic realignments, we have to ask, is a 60-year-old operational model one that relies entirely on the continuous, voluntary financial generosity of sovereign states to run the world's largest emergency logistics network, inherently, structurally unsustainable for the reality of the coming decades?
That is a profound structural question and exactly the kind of critical inquiry we want you to take away from this analysis. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this comprehensive breakdown provides you with a highly nuanced, mechanically precise understanding of the systems fighting global collapse. Keep interrogating the systems around you, keep learning, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.
Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. We are so glad you are joining us today. You've provided us with a truly fascinating set of sources to explore, centered around a really comprehensive look at it, the history, the mythology, and, well, the incredibly enduring modern legacy of the Amazons.
Yeah, it's a brilliant topic.
It really is. And our mission for you today is pretty clear, but certainly not simple. We're going to unearth the truth behind these legendary female warriors of Greek mythology.
Yeah.
We want to separate the ancient fiction from some genuinely stunning, dirt-under-the-fingernails archaeological facts.
It's the best kind of facts.
Right. And ultimately, we want to show you exactly why this ancient concept of the warrior woman still resonates so powerfully in our world today. It is quite the journey from the ancient Mediterranean to the modern era, and I cannot wait to get into it.
I'm ready when you are. To really understand the sheer impact of the Amazons, we have to set the stage by looking at how the classical world actually defined them.
Right, because it wasn't just a generic term.
Exactly. In the ancient Greek mindset, the Amazons were a society entirely unlike any other. They were a fiercely independent culture made up entirely of female warriors and hunters.
Like legendary for their physical agility.
Yes, their tremendous strength, their unmatched archery, and their masterful equestrian skills. But what really set them apart in the minds of the ancient Greeks was their social structure. This was a society strictly closed to men. They raised only their daughters.
And if they had sons?
Whenever they had sons, those boys were just returned to their fathers.
Wow.
Yeah, the Amazons only socialized with the men briefly, purely for the purpose of reproduction. It was a complete radical inversion of the patriarchal world the ancient Greeks lived in.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we are going to talk about the Amazons, we have to talk about the name itself. The ancient Greeks attached a rather gruesome, almost body horror etymology to the word, didn't they?
They certainly did. The popular folk etymology back in ancient times was that the word Amazon came from the Greek phrase amazos, which literally translates to breastless.
Wait, breastless. Why on earth would they call them that?
Well, the ancient writers really ran with this idea to explain their martial prowess. You have the ancient writer Marcus Justinus making this horrifying claim that Amazons actually had their right breast cut off or burnt out as children.
Oh my God.
Yeah, supposedly so they could better shoot a bow and throw a javelin without it getting in the way.
That sounds absolutely excruciating.
It does. And then you have Philostratus adding to the myth, claiming that Amazon babies were purposefully not fed on the right breast just to stunt its growth. It's a wildly vivid, very graphic image that got completely baked into their mythology.
But is there any truth to it at all?
None whatsoever. It is completely false.
Good, right.
Adrian Mayer and a host of modern scholars point out that this false etymology most likely birthed the entire physical myth of mutilation. If you look at the archaeological records, specifically the thousands of ancient Greek artworks, the pottery, the sculptures, the friezes that depict Amazon,
Both, right.
they are always represented with both breasts intact. Often one is covered by clothing or a piece of armor, but there is absolutely no indication in any ancient art of this mutilation practice.
So it basically made up a word origin and then had to
Invent a horrific backstory to justify it.
That is wild.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is where the word much more likely originated. Linguists point to the Iranian word Hamazon, which very simply means warriors.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Right. There is also another proposed Iranian phrase, Amajana, which translates to virility killing. So if we look at the linguistics, it is highly probable that a simple historical misunderstanding of a foreign word completely warped the physical image of these women for millennia.
A giant game of telephone.
Yeah, exactly. The Greeks heard a foreign word for warrior, shoehorned it into their own language to mean breastless, and then invented that gruesome backstory to make it make sense.
It's amazing how a simple translation error turns into a multi-millennia myth about self-mutilation. But regardless of where the name came from, once the Amazons were in the Greek mythological consciousness, they were absolutely everywhere. They were basically the ultimate crossover characters, constantly clashing with the biggest, most famous heroes of Greek myth.
They really were.
Huh.
The epicenters of these stories were usually placed at the very periphery of the known world, most famously at Themyscira on the banks of the Thermodon River, where the Amazon queens allegedly ruled.
Right, and you just have to look at the roll call of heroes they fought. Let's start with Heracles. His 9th labor was to travel to Themyscira and retrieve the magic belt of the Amazon queen, Hippolyte. But the sources say this wasn't supposed to be a massive battle, right?
That's the tragic part of the myth. According to the original stories, neither side initially wanted a fight. Heracles arrived with his men. Hippolyte actually respected his strength and reputation, and she was ready to freely give him the belt.
So what went wrong?
A misunderstanding. One orchestrated by a meddling goddess, Hera, who disguised herself as an Amazon and spread a rumor that Heracles was kidnapping the queen. That sparks a massive battle. It ends in a tragic, lethal clash where Heracles kills Hippolyte to get the belt.
It's such a chaotic escalation.
Yeah.
And that encounter seems to set a precedent for how the Amazons function in Greek storytelling, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. They are consistently used as the ultimate measuring stick for Greek heroes.
Yeah.
If you want to prove your hero is the absolute best, you have him face an Amazon. You see this perfectly with Theseus, the mythical founder hero of Athens.
What happens with Theseus?
Well, in the myths, Theseus actually abducts Queen Hippolyte, or in some versions of the story, her sister Antiope, and takes her back to Athens by force.
I'm guessing the Amazons didn't take that well.
The Amazons do not just let this go. They launch a massive coordinated revenge campaign. They invade Greece, they plunder the coast, and they literally besiege the city of Athens itself. This wasn't a minor skirmish on the borders. This was depicted as an existential threat to the very cradle of Greek civilization.
The idea of a foreign army of women laying siege to Athens must have been mind-blowing for the ancient Greeks. And then, of course, you have their role in the Trojan War epic cycle.
Yes, the Amazons arrive at one of the most critical moments of the war. After Hector dies, the Trojans are in dire straits. They're losing hope. And who comes to their rescue? Queen Penthesilea and her Amazon forces.
Just charging in.
They arrive and utterly put the Greeks under immense pressure, pushing them back until the greatest Greek warrior of them all, Achilles, finally steps in.
And that leads to one of the most famous one-on-one duels in mythology.
It does. Achilles fights Penthesilea in single combat and strikes a fatal blow. But the myth takes a deeply poignant turn. As she is dying, Achilles removes her helmet, sees her face, and famously falls in love with her, mourning her death bitterly. They aren't just faceless villains, they are respected, noble, and ultimately tragic figures in the Greek consciousness.
The logistics of their society in these myths are equally fascinating. We mentioned earlier that they didn't allow men in their society. How did the myths explain their survival from generation to generation?
The myths actually detail a very specific workaround for reproduction. They supposedly lived near an all-male tribe called the Gargarians up in the rugged Caucasian mountains. Once a year, in the spring, for exactly 2 months, the Amazons and the Gargarians would meet in secrecy in the mountains.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they would produce children together and then separate. The girls stayed with the Amazons to be raised as warriors, and the boys were sent back to the Gargarians. It is this perfectly constructed, almost mechanical myth to explain how a single-gender warrior society could sustain itself indefinitely.
It's a very tidy narrative solution, almost too tidy.
Precisely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, for a very long time, that tidy narrative was all we thought it was, just a story. For centuries, classical scholars looked at all of this, the epic battles, the Gargarian reproduction workaround, the remote cities, and concluded that the Amazons were entirely fictional.
They thought it was all just a metaphor.
Yes. The prevailing academic thought was that they were invented by Greek men to serve as the ultimate anti-women. Think about a typical ancient Greek woman. She was mostly expected to stay home, right?
Right.
She was confined to the domestic sphere, excluded from public life, politics, and certainly warfare. So, to a Greek man, the Amazon was their deepest societal anxiety brought to life. They were wild, entirely independent, dominant, and incredibly dangerous.
A total inversion of their normal.
Exactly. Other scholars argued they were purely allegorical, invented simply to symbolize foreign enemies like the invading Persians. They were seen as a psychological mirror for the Greeks, but certainly not flesh and blood historical realities.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because as much as the classical scholars loved the psychological allegory theory, the dirt had a very different story to tell. I want you, the listener, to just imagine the absolute shock of modern historians and archaeologists when they started digging and realized the ancient Greeks weren't entirely making this up. We pivot from mythology and poetry right into hard science. The shovels hit the dirt, and suddenly the fictional Amazon starts looking very, very real.
It was a massive paradigm shift in archaeology and history. The shift really began to gain momentum with the excavation of kurgan burial sites.
For those of us not in archaeology, what exactly is a kurgan?
A kurgan is a type of large burial mound. Imagine a massive, man-made hill rising up on the horizon, covering a complex wooden or stone tomb beneath the earth. Archaeologists started excavating these kurgans stretching across the vast Eurasian steppes. When we talk about the steppes, we aren't talking about city dwellers like the Greeks. Think of an ocean of grass-vast, rolling plains stretching all the way from the Black Sea in modern-day Ukraine, straight across Russia and into Mongolia.
And who was building these mounds?
This was the territory of the Scythian and Sarmatian horse cultures. These were nomadic peoples who dominated the steppes for centuries. They were practically born in the saddle. And when archaeologists started cataloging the skeletal remains and grave goods inside these kurgans, the statistics they uncovered were completely staggering.
What kind of numbers are we talking about here?
In the lower Don and Volga River regions, about 20% of the warrior graves contain women.
20%.
Yes, and these women weren't buried with domestic items. They were dressed for battle, buried with the exact same weapons as the men. And it gets even more pronounced with the Sarmatians, who came a bit later. Up to 25% of their military burials were armed women, buried alongside bows, arrows, spears, and horse riding gear.
So 1 in 4 warriors in some of these burial grounds were women. That is a fundamental rewriting of how we view ancient warfare. And to really bring this data to life, we don't even have to look that far back into the archives. There are incredibly recent specific discoveries that paint a vivid picture. I'm thinking of the dig in 2019, right?
Yes, the 2019 discovery near Voronezh in southwestern Russia. Archaeologists uncovered a remarkably preserved kurgan. It wasn't just a single isolated warrior, it contained multiple generations of Scythian female warriors buried together.
That's incredible.
We are talking about 4 women ranging from a young teenager to an older adult in her late 40s or 50s. They were buried in exquisite golden headdresses called kalathos and fully armed for combat with iron arrowheads, spears, and horse stack.
That generational aspect is key, isn't it? It just shows this wasn't just one exceptional woman who decided to pick up a sword. This was a culturally ingrained lifestyle. And then a couple of years before that, in 2017 in Armenia, they found another grave that told a much more violent story.
The Armenian discovery is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence we have. They found the grave of an Iron Age woman in her 20s, initially buried with beautiful jewelry, which might suggest a traditional aristocratic burial. But when bioarchaeologists examined her skeleton, the bones told a brutal story of a life spent in active combat.
What did the bones actually show?
Her skeletal structure showed the exact musculature and the specific traumatic injuries of a horseback warrior who saw frequent, heavy battle. The muscle attachments on her thigh bones were highly developed, exactly what you see in someone who spends their life gripping the sides of a galloping horse.
Oh, wow.
Her pectoral and shoulder bones showed the specific wear and tear of repeatedly drawing a heavy, high-tension bow. And most strikingly, they found an iron arrowhead physically embedded in her leg alongside healed sword cuts to her pelvis.
She lived, fought, and died on the battlefield. It's incredible to just picture that.
Those discoveries are profound because they completely anchor the myth in reality. When we look at those bones, we are looking directly at the inspiration for the Amazons. When you connect the dots of the Scythian and Sarmatian lifestyle, it makes perfect practical sense.
Right, because their lifestyle demanded it.
Exactly. These were nomadic, horse-centered cultures. In a nomadic society, everyone has to pull their weight. The men were frequently away for long periods, either hunting across vast distances or fighting in distant campaigns. The women who remained behind couldn't just be passive. They had to be able to competently defend themselves, their children, their massive herds of livestock, and their grazing pastures from rival tribes, raiders, and predators.
And the horse was the great equalizer.
Precisely. If you are fighting on foot with heavy bronze shields like the Greeks, brute upper body strength is paramount. But if you are fighting from horseback with a composite recurve bow, agility, balance, and skill matter far more. A well-aimed arrow fired by a woman on a galloping horse is just as lethal as one fired by a man.
So it wasn't some mythical ideological matriarchy designed to spite men, as the Greeks imagined. It was a purely practical, harsh survival lifestyle on the steppes.
Yes. But you can easily see how Greek explorers, colonists, or traders venturing to the edges of the Black Sea, encountering these fierce, horseback-riding, bow-wielding women, would be both deeply terrified and intensely inspired. They took that practical reality, brought it home, and spun it into the towering legend of the Amazons.
So what does this all mean? We have this very real kernel of truth from the Eurasian steppes, wrapped in thick layers of Greek mythology. But the story doesn't stop in the ancient Mediterranean world. The myth, the Amazon, permeated global history in ways that are just astonishing. Let's fast forward a couple of millennia to the year 1542, halfway across the globe. We have the Spanish explorer Francisco de Orellana.
Yes, Orellana's expedition is a fascinating example of how the myth traveled. He and his crew were navigating a massive, uncharted river basin in South America. During his expedition along a tributary, the Namunda River, they encountered and fought a brutal skirmish against a tribe of fiercely warlike indigenous women.
And local traditions actually had a name for them, right?
They did. They referred to them as the Icamiabas. Orellana and his heavily armed Spanish conquistadors were absolutely stunned by the ferocity and tactical skill of these female warriors. They defended their villages with such intensity that they reminded Orellana vividly of the ancient Greek myths he had learned back in Europe.
That's fascinating.
He was so struck by the parallel that he decided to name the entire massive region and the river itself Amazonia.
It's incredible to think that the largest rainforest and river system on Earth is named after a Greek myth, which was in turn inspired by Scythian nomads in Russia.
It perfectly illustrates how deeply the Amazon archetype was embedded in the global consciousness. The concept of the female warrior totally transcends individual cultures. And while Orellana was projecting a European myth onto South America, there are instances where the reality matched the myth entirely independently.
Like in West Africa.
Yes. Consider the Kingdom of Dahomey, located in present-day Benin. From the 18th to the early 20th century, they maintained a highly structured, all-female official military regiment.
How did they operate? Were they just a ceremonial guard, or...?
Not at all. Internally, they were called the Mino, which translates to our mothers, and they were frontline shock troops. They went through grueling physical training, they were armed with muskets and machetes, and they were ferociously effective in active combat. They took captives, they led vanguard assaults, and they were feared by neighboring kingdoms.
And how did Westerners react when they encountered them?
When 19th century Western observers and colonial forces encountered the Melun, they were completely bewildered. They immediately fell back on that same ancient Greek touchstone, just like Orellana did. They dubbed these African warriors the Dahomey Amazons because the ancient myth was literally the only cultural framework they had to understand such formidable, organized female soldiers.
It's fascinating how the word just becomes a universal shorthand for female empowerment and martial strength, no matter the continent.
This raises an important question. Why is the symbol of the Amazon so remarkably enduring? Even when the spears are buried and the horses are gone, the core idea remains incredibly potent.
You definitely see the legacy persisting in totally different forms into the modern era, especially in social movement.
Absolutely. Look at modern social activism. During the early 1900s, members of the militant suffragette movement in the UK and the US women who were fighting fiercely, sometimes physically, for the right to vote, were frequently referred to in newspapers and books of the time as Amazons. Yeah, it started as a title of derision from their political enemies, attempting to paint them as unnatural or monstrous, but it quickly became a title of empowerment that the women themselves embraced.
They reclaimed the word. And of course, the legacy thrives in pop culture. You can't talk about Amazons today without mentioning Wonder Woman. In 1941, psychologist William Moulton Marston created the character, explicitly drawing on the ancient Amazon mythology, complete with her origins on a hidden island, to craft a modern, global icon of female empowerment, justice, and strength.
The myth just constantly adapts. Even today, there's a real-life martial arts group in Ukraine called the Asgarda, led by a woman named Katerina Tarnovska. She claims her group is a new, modern tribe of Amazons.
Wow, bringing it full circle.
Exactly. They draw a direct ancestral line back to those very Scythian warriors who rode across the steppes thousands of years ago, creating an all-female martial art to encourage women to build their physical strength and stand confidently against restrictive societal norms. The myth simply refuses to die.
It really does. It is just so potent. From a misunderstood Iranian word for warriors, to epic, tragic clashes with Heracles and Achilles, from the undeniable, hard archaeological proof of Scythian warrior women buried with their bows in the Russian steppes, all the way to a Spanish explorer naming the world's most famous river, and Wonder Woman lighting up movie screens today. What a journey. Thank you to our listener for bringing such a rich, complex set of sources to the table for us to dive into today.
It has been an absolute pleasure to unpack. And before we go, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, drawn from the text, but touching on something we haven't explicitly discussed yet. In ancient Greece, there was an early writer and skeptic named Polyphaetus. He wrote a book trying to rationalize away all the magical or unbelievable elements of Greek myths, and he argued vehemently that the Amazons couldn't have possibly existed because he, personally, had never seen one.
Sounds like a typical skeptic.
Right. His working theory was that the Amazons were probably just men wearing long clothes who tied their hair up in headbands, shaved their beards off, and were simply mistaken for women by their confused enemies in the heat of battle.
You're kidding.
No, he was so sure of his own rigid worldview that he completely rationalized them out of existence. But knowing what we know now, having seen the iron arrowheads embedded in the bones of warrior women in Armenia and Russia, it makes you wonder, if history's earliest skeptics were so incredibly eager to explain away female warriors as just clean-shaven men, what other incredible paradigm-shifting historical truths have been completely erased by the assumptions of the past, just waiting in the dirt to be washed away?